Hello, it's Wednesday night, and I'm here with my dear friend and a brilliant man, Dr. Anthony Monteiro. And we're going to talk about Gaza. We're going to talk about Ukraine and the political realignment in the U.S. We've got plenty to talk about. Let's talk. Hello, Garland here with one of our favorite guests, Dr. Anthony Monteiro, doing fantastic work in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Monteiro, welcome back to our YouTube show.
Thank you so much, Garland. It's always a pleasure.
Well, there's a lot going on right now in the United States, and we're going to try to make some sense of it. With the deep state making their move to take out Trump, that seems to between the Fani Willis and the Supreme Court, it seems like their attempt to pull the rug out from under Donald Trump before the election has faltered. We've got the uncommitted, the Muslim community really leading the move against Joe Biden. There seems to be a political realignment afoot in the United States. Dr. Monteiro, maybe you could explain that to us.
Well, I'll try. Of course, this is the day after Super Tuesday, which kind of sealed the deal on what the general election will be. Nikki Haley, of course, ended or suspended her presidential bid. Donald Trump is about 200 delegates away from being the nominee. And that could happen in the next few weeks with the upcoming primaries. So we're looking at what will be a very consequential election. This is, of course, more than about Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It's about much, much more. If it was just that, the stakes would not be this high. The fight would not be as bitter as it already is and as bitter as it will become. It will look increasingly like a political civil war, and the standoff is between the neocon war party and the neoliberal globalists opposing what in essence is a angry, discontented, increasingly impoverished working and middle class of the United States. This is the closest we have been perhaps since the election of 1860 to a class political standoff and election. By that I mean the divisions between the forces who are contending in this election are increasingly the working people, the working class, and the ruling elite. And the question on the table is, can the ruling elite continue to rule? Just one other thing, because I think most people who are led in their thinking by the mainstream media are not asking the right questions. They're asking some of the right questions, of course, and some of the answers to the questions asked by the mainstream media are answered in the polling numbers, which show Trump leading often by not a great deal, but leading in all of the polls and in the polls in the battleground states. So in a lot of ways, if the election were held today, just if we take an election, if it were held today, Trump would win and Biden would lose. But the election is not going to be held today. We have several months of bitter struggle. But here is the question that must, I think, be asked and must be answered. What is the character of the American electorate at this time, and how does it differ from what it was in 2020, 2016, let us say going back to 2000? What has happened over the last 23 years, 24 years, among the American people, among the American electorate, that makes it this different political configuration than it was then? And I would say this: I think 24 years of unending war and austerity, topped by inflation, has outraged the American working people and has led them to conclude that the elite that have ruled the country now for over 50 years, this group of elites, some would say last 30 years, maybe they're right, the neocons rising to power. The American people are rejecting them. The American electorate does not want war, and they're saying it over and over again. They want the problems of the nation to be solved, and they don't want them solved on the basis of policies that will produce inflation. And inflation is just another way of talking about austerity. We're looking at a different electorate. Politically, we're going into a period that will look like a political civil war. And it is, the divide, I should say, is more or less along class lines. And this, just my last point, Garland. I know I've talked too long.
No, go ahead.
What began as essentially a white movement and a movement of white working and lower middle class people, for the most part, is now increasingly a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious movement. Increasingly African American working people, Latino and Mexican working people, and now with the abandoned Biden movement, Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian working people are joining what is and what is emerging as a working class, working people, lower middle class, anti-establishment, anti-war, anti-genocide, anti-austerity movement.
Now, let me ask you this, because within that movement, there are people that are, I'm all pro-Trump, I love Trump because I think Trump's the answer, right? There are people who are the clothespin voters who put a clothespin on their nose and say, I'm going to vote for Trump because I had one person say to me recently, true story, very good friend of mine, said he's a Puerto Rican and he's over to the left where I am, right? But he sees Trump as I put it this way, he just wants somebody to come into the White House with an axe. He don't care what it is as long as they're swinging the axe when they come through the door, right? And recently, we were talking. He doesn't keep on, and I said, "Yeah, did you see the New York case where they are, saying Donald Trump has to pay $350 million for whatever, right? They've got 90 or 100 cases against them." Interestingly, when I said that, he says, "That's it. I'm voting for Trump." That's what he said. He doesn't like a Trump. I mean, he's ideologically certainly not aligned with Trump. He's aligned with me. It just angered him. And when I asked him why, he wasn't really sure. You know what I mean? But he said, that's it. They pissed me off so bad, I'm going to vote for Trump. And so now this is another guy who's voting for Trump. He already was furious. Biden and the Democrats feeling he's been deceived. He's been had for all of these years. He's where I am, where you are. But he wasn't for Trump. But when he heard that, that's it. I'm voting for Trump. What do you think of that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, that's understandable. But let's not lose sight of the fact that we're talking about a political movement of over 125 million people. So individuals are deciding in different ways what they will do politically in terms of casting a vote. I think the more significant thing is the change of thinking. What your friend, the way I read his remarks, what he is saying, that I am fed up with the arrogance, the hubris, the totalitarian behavior of the ruling elite. And if they think, and this is a lot of people saying if they think that a couple of months of inflation going down, or some experts talking about the economy ticking up, or the claim that unemployment is at the lowest it's been in 50 years, all of that. If they think, people are saying, if they think that they can buy us off with their statistics, with their narrative, they have another thought coming. Because we're not just talking about the last few months. We're talking about, as I mentioned, this 24-year cycle of unending war and austerity. Let us not forget, when you finance wars by printing money, that is a recipe for inflation. It was just a matter of time before it broke out the way it broke out in the last couple of years. And now working people, ordinary people recognize that this inflation is not going away, that their standard of living is being attacked. People cannot afford to buy a house because of mortgage rates. And of course, the prices of houses going up. There are things that people had expected that they would be able to do and to have, which is not going to be the case. So I think your friend, and I think the majority of people, are voting and thinking in ways that say that this election will be a vote for or against the ruling elite. And again, by the ruling elite, I mean the neocons, that is the permanent war people, the defenders of U.S. empire and its 800 or so military bases around the world, and the neoliberals, those who believe that the U.S. dollar and the manipulation of the world economy through the U.S. dollar, this has brought nothing but suffering and uncertainty to the masses of people, while producing profits and wealth at an unseen level for the ruling elite. People are fed up with it, and that's what we're hearing. Your friend is one example. There are other examples. You could take, again, I'm from Philadelphia, and I often talk about Philadelphia, and I know the politics here pretty well. Black people see the Biden administration through the lens of the local Black political class and what they have not achieved in terms of the lives and conditions of life of the majority of Black people in the city. So Black folk in Philadelphia, in Cleveland, in Chicago, in St. Louis, wherever you wish to go, in these huge cities, are saying that the party of Biden has not been good for Black people. They are concerned with Black people when it comes to our vote on election day, but for the rest of the time, we don't even count. We're not even in the conversation. So I think people are upset, are angry across the board. This election is a political choice between the forces of the ruling elite, as I said, the neocons and them, and the people's interest. It's not all defined. It's not all clear. A lot of contradictions. The contradiction of race is still in the equation. And for Black people, the question of what will white people do, and etc. What will the MAGA movement do when we join it, when we vote for Trump? And so there are a lot of questions, but I think the sentiment is quite similar across the board.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Any port in a storm, as they say. Because I see people in the chat making legitimate criticisms of Trump. We could do an hour where we could make very legitimate criticisms of Trump. But oddly enough, the ruling elite, the Democratic Party, for years have made this argument that's coming back to haunt them. You've got to go to us because you've got to take the lesser of two evils. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's coming back to haunt them because I truly believe there are people looking at Biden and Blinken and these lunatics saying and looking at Trump and saying that, you know what, I'm going to vote like you said I should vote, the lesser of two evils, and you have become the greater evil over Trump. It seems to, as I said, I could spend an hour showing the glaring contradictions of Donald Trump symbolizing the working class. That is reasonable. But if I do truly go by the lesser of two evils, clearly at this point, Donald Trump is the lesser evil between him and Joe Biden.
Oh, yeah, I would agree with that. I would agree with that. And when you look at the wars that the United States is involved in, and you look at the wars that they say they want to get involved with, including China and North Korea. When you look at this, the Biden administration and the forces that control Biden, when one looks at them, one is looking at a very dark future. It is a future of endless war, and now wars with two superpowers, Russia and China, and a war to defend Israel against the Arab nations and the Palestinian people. Didn't we just have an ignominious retreat from Afghanistan? Didn't we just go through that after 20 years of war? Are we now going to go again into the Middle East for 20 more years? More bitter fighting, in fact. More genocide? Is that what we're looking at in the future? Or are we going to decide politically in this election to say enough is enough, at least of that war party, at least of that? And of course, I do not set a high bar in terms of an election. The election is just a statement of where the people are. It's not a statement of where they might go. I see a defeat for Biden as the beginning of a new political alignment and a new political struggle, which means the two big questions: war and peace on the one side, and austerity and poverty on the other. Can we survive these two evils? I don't think so. So Biden has to be stopped. He is an evil that humanity cannot survive if he is elected or reelected.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I tend to have the feeling that the Biden administration, that in 4 more years after what I've seen is,
Right.
it may be curtains for all of us. As sad
That's
as
right.
I mean, it's not an unreasonable, it's not an irrational evaluation to look at the aggressiveness against nuclear powers and see, at minimum, complete and total destruction of the economy by some war against Iran or China or whoever, and at maximum some nuclear confrontation that ends life on Earth. So I think that the stakes here are so high. Additionally, even for those who want to rebuild the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, a third party, whatever the case may be, you've got to clean these Nazi lunatics that are in the Democratic Party out of office before, otherwise they're so aggressive that they will attempt to crush anybody, use all machinations to crush anybody who tries to start a legal and legitimate movement against them. So even in order to clear the field enough to get started, you've got to get them out of the way in order to get moving. So the people that say, I want another party, the people that say, I want to rebuild the Democratic Party, you can't do any of that until you clean these people out.
That's right. That's right. And so much of the left, or what defines itself as the left, over these last more or less 8 years, have been absolutely wrong. When they sided with Hillary Clinton, and then Joe Biden, they were absolutely wrong, albeit loud and boisterous in their wrong-headedness. They were wrong. And among other things, in this movement forward, we have to think about what is the left, and can a new type of left be reconstituted or constituted? This left and its so-called political parties, which we can get into, a lot of it funded from the nonprofit sector, which is nothing more than corporations and the government funding those so-called nonprofit organizations that serve their interests. In a lot of ways, the ruling elite has found a way to do domestically what they had done in foreign policy in terms of color revolutions, to define what the discourse is, to define who is acceptable, to fund ideas and movements that do not fundamentally challenge their rule, their governing power. That's over, I think. The so-called left is much of it is worthless in terms of the people, and the people don't pay them much attention anyway. I think the most important developments for peace are the developments concerning Gaza and the genocide being carried out there. It not only exposes the Netanyahu government, but exposes the American government, and in particular, the Biden administration, and the movement of the Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian people in Michigan, in Minnesota, in Pennsylvania, and other places. The abandoned Biden movement is a principled political movement, and we need more of that. We need it in the labor movement. The labor movement, the leaders of the labor movement have made a huge mistake in this embrace of Biden. It's a huge mistake. I mean, when did war serve the interest of working people? So why do you keep endorsing candidates who have brought us nothing but war? Why do you continue to do it? I was particularly angered by Sean Fain, the head of the UAW, coming out the way he did for Biden, as though Biden is the greatest friend that Labor has ever had in the White House. But how can a war maker, a supporter of genocide, be a friend of Labor, especially in Michigan, when a large part of the UAW are Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims? You understand what I'm saying? This is egregious. So there has to be a redoing of all of these movements, including the African American People's Movement. I think you know this, Garland. Most African Americans are fed up with what passes for the Black political class, which is really a Black misleadership class. Most of us are fed up. In Philadelphia, we're so fed up, we don't even vote anymore. I mean, when in certain wards, you only have 3% of the people turning out, of the eligible voters. So I think this is a realignment. In the last 90 years, there have been two great political realignments. The first was during the Great Depression and the New Deal. That was a political realignment where the labor movement and the Black movement came together and became the foundation or the ground upon which the Democratic Party stood, the Black Labor Alliance, as it was called. The second was that which came out of the great Black freedom movement of the 50s and 60s, another realignment where Blacks decided that the Republican Party, which had changed as a consequence of the civil rights movement and are getting the right to vote, and the Republican Party becoming what the Southern Democratic Party had become, a party of white people and of white supremacy. And Black folk decided that to fight that, their party would be the Democratic Party. And of course, then we see the great struggle for leadership, for a voice at the table of the Democratic Party. We saw many presidential campaigns. Of course, the most important before the Obama campaign was Jesse Jackson's in '84 and '88, where it was he and the Black community saying, in effect, that we cannot just be voters for Democrats, we have to be at the decision-making table. And then, of course, many people thought that the election in 2008 of Obama represented the fulfillment of that, which ironically it was not. It turned out to be the opposite of that, and a waylaying and a obscuring of the real interests of the Black community. However, in this realignment, and I want to underline this more than anything else I say, Black people abandoning the Democratic Party, Black people abandoning Biden, a drop of 30% in the Black support for Joe Biden. This is catastrophic. If these Black votes are not won back, Biden cannot win. Certainly, with those numbers, he cannot win Philadelphia. And if he can't win Philadelphia, he doesn't win Pennsylvania. The same goes for Wisconsin and Milwaukee. The same goes for Michigan and Detroit. The Democrats lose the Black vote, they lose national elections. But the realignment, the moving away from the Democratic Party, are they becoming Republicans? I don't think so. I think what Black folk and what the majority of the people involved in this Trump movement are saying, We want to be a part of a movement for change, not a political party that is seeking to elect officials, most of whom are opportunists and so on. So the electorate is different. The electorate, people who vote, are not what they were even 8 years ago in 2016. It is a different electorate. Everybody doesn't think the same. It is at this point without a secure leadership. But these are questions that have to be answered in the course of struggle, in the course of changing the American system from a democracy for a few to a new democracy for the people. In many ways, it is almost the fulfillment of the Martin Luther King vision for an end to war, poverty, and racism. People say, well, how are these white people who identify themselves as white, how will they ever change from the habits, from the ideas that have defined them and their parents and grandparents for all of these generations? Can they change? I kind of take the James Baldwin position. They can change, but they will change because they have no other option. It is almost as though whiteness as privilege, whiteness as opportunity, whiteness as certainty about your future in the American social economy. Well, all of that is in a very perilous state right now. To be white doesn't really mean that much. It does mean, however, if you are white and live in certain suburbs, that you are in the center of the fentanyl epidemic. It means that. It means that you have debt that you will never pay off. It means that you might get a job, but it's not a secure lifetime job. And it means that you'll never buy a house, which therefore means that your whiteness might do something for you psychologically, but materially it does not. And in many respects, when I look at parts of Philadelphia and I look at places like Butler, Pennsylvania, which are pretty much all white, or other formerly industrial towns and cities, medium-sized cities and towns in Pennsylvania, and I look at the conditions of white people in those places, and I look at the conditions of Black people in some of the poorest working class parts of Philadelphia, I don't see that much difference. And I think that the people, the white folk who are suffering in these communities and the Black folk who are in these big cities don't really see that much difference separating them.
Well, and that's what it is. I think people are figuring out, that as Malcolm X said, we have a common oppressor.
Right.
I think that what we're looking at, Paul Robeson Jr. used to talk about, I remember him saying to me, when a Black person, a white person, a Puerto Rican person, they all live side by side. They all work down at the mill. They all have the same needs. They all have the same economic needs. They all have, the kids need education, all of these things that they need. And he said, and the ruling elite's job is to make them hate each other.
Right.
To make them dislike each other, to make them not join the same union and fight together against the owners of that mill so they can all get a fair job. I think the ruling elite have done that job.
Yeah.
I think the ruling elite now have they don't care if you're Black, white, green, gray, or grizzly. The ruling elite see the working class as fuel to be burned for their system, however they need to burn it. And I think that's one of the things that's awakening people. Now, there's certainly those that are trying to use race, use religion, use whatever they can to get us fighting. But I think the ruling elite's oppression of the working class is forcing working class of all people to come together to fight a universal fight against that oppression.
Oh yeah, I don't think there's any two ways about it. It's so obvious to me that I can't see why everybody doesn't see it. Something new is emerging. We are not, as the people who run the Democratic Party and the mainstream media and yada yada yada, like they try to tell us, this election is about defending our democracy. I mean, after we get up off the floor from laughing, what are you talking about? When did we vote on any of these wars in our democracy? When did we decide on what monetary policy would be? We, the people, have not had a say in any of this, although we've paid the cost for all of it. This is the contradiction in a specific American way. Don't look to Europe to find an answer in its history. It's not going to come from there. America, in many ways, is a different animal. First of all, we have a two-party system. There's not been much room for political protest or for even parties that protest or parties of the left to achieve even government representation, let alone overall political power. We don't have it that way. So it's going to be a path forward that sees, one, parties and the contest of parties and the electoral contest, but then we're going to see movements. An example of that, we've always had it in the 1930s. It wasn't Franklin Roosevelt or Harry Hopkins or Henry Wallace who thought up all of these New Deal ideas. They were pushed by a mass movement, in particular, the labor movement, the organizing drives in auto and steel and electrical, but also by the rising Black movement in the South for civil rights. That's what pushed and shaped the contours of the New Deal. Take the 1950s and 60s. It was not Kennedy that decided the future of his own party. It was Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. So parties in this two-party configuration have been forced to respond to forces outside of the party system if they wish to stay in, if the ones in power wish to hold on to power in one or another form. This is precisely what we're looking at now. This is not a Republican Party affair as much as it is a movement of angry people. If what verifies this point? There is no way that after the poor showings of the Republican Party in 2022, in particular, and people would have thought that, well, Trump is done. This movement of discontent no longer has its leader. But how does Trump arise now to have be the most dominant political figure in the country and to control what happens with the Republican Party, state by state by state? When he wins, all of these state primaries and caucuses, and then does it sweepingly on Super Tuesday. This is more than about a political party. This is about a movement seizing a political party to serve the interests of that movement. And the interests of that movement at this point is that the politicians that they support must sufficiently express or reflect the anger and discontent of the people. And frankly, what I took Super Tuesday to say is that there will be no compromise. Nikki Haley, the compromise candidate. Ron DeSantis, the compromise. Republican, I'm for the Republican Party, but I'm not for the for the Trump movement. You know, we politicians can handle this. That's what they mean by these traditional Republicans. Well, they've all been kicked to the curb, including Liz Cheney and even Mitch McConnell has had to step down and admit the defeat of his political position in the face of this. And it's on and on. If you can read it properly, it all makes a lot of sense. Lindsey Graham, you know, the supreme opportunist, warmonger, is trying to hold on, but he's not fooling anybody. Tim Scott, the grinning hyena that passes for a black man, you know, he's trying to save his political life. It's a good thing to be a senator, you know, a lot of perks. Mitt Romney has had to retreat totally from politics, completely defeated by this movement. So the party is bending to the movement. Trump has been resurrected by a movement that is much larger than him. And therefore, when he says to the people who vote for him and that come to his rallies, I am your retribution. This is heavy language. Streetwise, it's like saying it's get back time. It's get back. And now you ruling elites will have to pay a price for what you did to these masses of people over these decades.
Well, you know, one of the things I recall, when it's funny that you talk about movements and color revolutions and fake movements.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Hillary Clinton, that those people were really exposed immediately when Donald Trump won the first time. And again, this is not some pro-Trump thing. Trump is a symbol, but symbolic, to me, extremely symbolic. But that being said, when afterwards there were these gigantic rallies, they had the pink hats, remember the pussy hats and all this stuff, and it was the women's whatever. So they had these gigantic rallies, right? Hillary Clinton was there, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the voices for the elite, right? Oh, the New York Times and the Washington Post, where all the intelligence communities were up and completely thrilled. There was not a demand. You had a so-called women's movement. They didn't have a demand. A so-called, we've got to stop Trump. Not one demand. They didn't ask for anything. They did. That's how I looked at it. And I'm like, that sounds like a cat's paw for the ruling elite. I see all of and they're like, we're women. We're in the street. We're fighting back. And I kept looking, saying, at some point, is somebody going to have a sign that says, do this, do that? All they had was Trump is evil, Trump is evil, Trump is evil. And I realized they're not representing left. Martin Luther King, when he went to the mall, he asked for jobs. He asked for a $2 an hour minimum wage. You know what I mean? There was something. Martin Luther King just didn't say, set my people free, I'm Moses. He said, people, not just black folks, people. need to be able to make a decent living to feed their family. He had something. These people did not have a demand. I think that should have been a clue to most of us that this was a cat's paw for the ruling elite, and that the Democratic Party at that point, to the Clinton, Biden, Obama, all of the above movement, was simply a fraud.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah. There is no question about it. You know, sometimes I think of, I think of the civil rights or Black freedom movement as a revolutionary movement that only partially achieved its objectives. And we have lived in the throes of a counter-revolution against that for the last 40, 50 years. War is an attack upon civil rights. You can't be for Black people's rights and at the same time be for war, because the substance of Black people's rights means a setting of new priorities in the country, which means rather than a military industrial complex, we need a peace industrial complex. But that having been said, indeed you are right. People are concerned with their lives, with their day-to-day lives. Now, abortion and the Supreme Court. This issue has the potential of re-electing Joe Biden. Less so than in 2022. But the right wing of or I should say the conservative wing, the evangelical wing of the Trump movement and of the Republican Party are trumpeting the Supreme Court's decision on abortion as a great victory, a great moral victory, a great political victory. It is not that. Now, Trump is going to have to thread the needle. First of all, he cannot be for these extreme these laws, congressional laws to outlaw abortion or to so restrict it that is worthless. In fact, women under the 14th Amendment have to be seen as a group to be protected. In other words, the historic discrimination against women, like the historic discrimination against African Americans. I'm not saying they're the same, but I'm just saying historic discrimination demands 14th Amendment protections for them as a group. And part of the protection of them as a group is their right to adequate and complete health care, including the right to choose whether they carry a birth to term. But you know, that has to be worked out. However, the abortion question in this election will not be a decider. And just the way you put it, people are constantly talking about the border and immigration, which is not immigration, it is a labor question. That is what the border is. Do you bring in workers who have no rights and can be abused and used by the bosses however they want to, and thus threaten workers that are already established? Is that going to be allowed because it serves the rich, the boss class? Or is there going to be some restriction, some control on that in the interest of protecting especially the poorest and least well-educated workers who tend to be Black and brown? That is why Black people and Mexicans are so much against all of this open border stuff, because they realize it as an attack upon their position and their rights as workers in the absence of unions that could have protected them. So the border and immigration is a labor question. Most voters respond to it as a labor question. The question of the right to an abortion is a health question, a woman's question, but ultimately a labor question. Whether or not a woman can decide when and under what conditions she carries she carries a birth to term, or does she have to make a class decision? Do I terminate a pregnancy because I have to work and I cannot afford at this time to do it? So it gets, all of this can be seen as part of a broad labor, working class configuration of issues. Now, what is uppermost? If you look at the polls, the border, war, and inflation. It does, I mean, from the standpoint of radical politics and analysis, it doesn't get any better than that. Because here are all of the issues that a real left, that a real revolutionary or radical movement, it is here that we enter the struggle of the broad masses of the American people. Anybody, let me say this, I don't want to sound too emotional, excited about this. Anybody that calls him or herself a person of the left and votes for Joe Biden or campaigns for Joe Biden in this presidential election cycle, is a fraud and a hypocrite and should be rejected by the people. And the people should say, if there will be a left, it will emerge from the people in the same way that the left of the 60s emerged out of the civil rights movement. That's where it came from. And the women's movement all came out of that small little city in Alabama known as Montgomery. That's the point of origin. That's the beginning, And in the same way, this discontent is so parallel to the historic objectives of the left in this country going back to the 1930s. So parallel that we could not ask for a better time. People are willing to listen. People say, well, Trump, when he talks, he's anti-communist, he's anti-socialist. It's almost like it's a comedy movie, the way they throw rhetoric around. The Dems call him a fascist. He calls them socialists, communists, and fascists, and none of them knows what the hell they're talking about. But, that kind of comes with the territory at this time.
Let me ask you this about the importance of Gaza, about how it exposes the ruling elite, about Yemen and what we've learned about the ability of the poorest country in the region to put a stop to or to have such a dramatic effect on international shipping, et cetera. Your thoughts on that Gaza conflict and the importance of it at this time?
I think October 7th changed everything. First of all, because Gaza is in that part of the world where since the end of World War II, some of the most bloody conflicts have been fought. And this is an area of the world where the very existence of the state of Israel has been a provocation to war. And of course, the Israeli state is a militarist, now I would argue, Nazi regime. And if we want to talk about a two-state solution, and I'm not against that, within the bounds of the international law and Security Council resolutions, etc., it doesn't work unless Israel is demilitarized and denazified. The people of Western Asia, the Middle East, cannot live together as long as there's a regime and a state that is committed to the destruction and genocide against part of the population that lives in that part of the world. So I think October 7th changed everything. Unimaginable events have occurred, such as the Houthis, Al-Ansar Allah, who have literally imposed sanctions upon Israel. That is what they're doing in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, and now in parts beyond the Red Sea. What they are doing, and I think they can defend their position under international law. They are acting to end a genocide, to prevent the genocide from going forward. And this comes out of World War II and the Nuremberg trials and international law that was built after the defeat of the Nazi regime in Germany. That international law protects states, non-state actors, and others who act to prevent a genocide. I'm often reminded of the example of the Christian preacher Bonhoeffer, who was a Christian and never considered doing anything violent against another human being. In the face of Hitler, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his colleagues, who knew nothing about killing or assassination, decided that to stop Hitler and to stop the genocide and the Holocaust, that they would have to assassinate Hitler. Well, of course, he was executed. He was caught and executed. But international law, which emerged after World War II, protected him and did not see his act as a criminal act or a criminal conspiracy. The same holds for the Houthis. I believe they are protected by international law because they are acting, and I would argue they are a non-state actor. They are acting against a genocide. They're acting to prevent it. They're acting to prevent arms and other materiel reaching Israel. So indeed, that is the case for them. But then another factor in the whole equation, and that is Iran. Iran is now playing a larger role in Western Asia than they did before October 7th. They're playing a bigger role than they did right after the US war in Iraq, or their role, the Iranian role in Syria. Their role is huge because around Iran has emerged a axis, what they call an axis of resistance, of powerful fighting forces, many of whom are non-state, but then they're state actors because the Iran-Iraq alliance, the Iran-Syria alliance are powerful forces alongside Hezbollah, alongside the Houthis, alongside Hamas, alongside the various fighting forces in the West Bank of Palestine. So, I mean, the world has changed so significantly that the Russian government is hosting representatives of Hamas in Moscow officially, at Hamas and the Palestinian Authority together, where I think the Chinese government has been talking about a world peace conference dealing with the Palestinian question. And this is significant that they have to go outside of the UN organization, and especially the Security Council, where the US has this veto power, and go to a world conference to decide the parameters of the peace settlement for the Palestinians and so on. But my last point, the role of BRICS and the role of an expanded BRICS plus Saudi Arabia, BRICS plus the United Arab Emirates. You know, this new international configuration, which comes to the table saying, look, we don't have any particular interest, personal national interest in this. Our interest is in world peace and preventing conflict and genocide. Big, huge thing. And then, of course, as part of BRICS, the South African government taking the Israeli regime to the International Criminal Court, or International Court of Justice, forgive me. And the court, while not making a final decision yet, has in fact agreed with the argument of the South African government that Israel is probably involved in a genocide, by which the court means intentionally killing non-combatants. So I think the world is different. I think it's a very positive world going forward.
You know, two things. China recently, you know, and those of us who have, you know, understood, you know, the comments, the anti-imperialist comments, and recall the legacy of the anti-imperialist comments made by Mao. Yes. The Chinese recently went in that direction. They made many of us kind of recall that legacy when they came out. The Chinese government came out and said that the Palestinians have a right to armed struggle to defend themselves against an occupation. That's one. Number two, both Sergei Lavrov and President Putin openly recalled and discussed the legacy of the Soviet Union in talking about the need to rebuild the relationships that they had with what they call the global majority. Now they're calling it the global majority, Africa in particular, Latin America, Asia, etc., the anti-imperialist bloc, right? There was a statement, Sergei Lavrov toured South America, and he made a statement when he recalled the USSR and the things that they did. And now we're hearing from Putin, now we're hearing from Lavrov, and we're hearing statements from the Chinese that take us back to that time when they said, look, we've got to support anyone out there who's fighting against the imperialists, fighting against the hegemon. I think that they understand the importance of this time. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you know, it is so interesting, the change over the last 2 years in the thinking and public pronouncements of the Russian government. I mean, 2 years ago, let's say 3 years ago, they seemed to be carrying the water of the West. Putin was always referring to the Western nations as our partners, you know. But the Western nations, Western leaders never referred to him as their partner. They always saw him and talked about him as an authoritarian dictatorship, something close to Hitler. But now they speak differently. of course, the Xi Jinping government in China has been, I think, more clear in what it is, what its objectives are. One, it is to defend China, all of China, including Taiwan, but it is also to create a environment for global trade, the Belt and Road, and what Xi Jinping calls a win-win situation. Well, the win-win objectively cuts the West out of a special place in world trade and finance, which means that when Xi Jinping talks about win-win, he's talking about a multipolar world. And in a multipolar world, everybody wins, everybody has an interest in it. But in a multipolar world, the dollar does not dominate. So indeed, China's foreign policy has always been a foreign policy of the global South, as it is called, what I like to more accurately call the Afro-Asiatic axis of world politics. If you go back to that period that you were mentioning, when the Soviet Union existed, the countries coming out of colonialism were not called the global South. They were called the Afro-Asiatic movement, the anti-colonial movement. And you know, well, we're still in the throes of the anti-colonial movement, but now it's the anti-neo-colonial movement. So the breaking of the power of the dollar, the weakening of the hegemonic dominance of the United States and the West, the rejecting of their military bases and their foreign policy based upon the dollar and military bases. All of this bodes well for first of all, for Africa, the weakening of the West, which has had a greater stranglehold on Africa than any other continent in the world. The weakening of the West, the weakening of the franc, the weakening of the French government is to the advantage of Africa. And the Africans in the diplomatic realm have begun to reflect that. Their votes in the General Assembly against the Israeli genocide and calling for a permanent ceasefire, their reluctance to follow the lead of the United States in the UN General Assembly and vote the US position on the Ukraine and against Russia. And then going forward, we see all of these new and rich relationships between Africa and Russia. You mentioned Sergei Lavrov, this probably the greatest diplomat alive today. His Africa tours, which I think have been his most significant diplomatic forays, and the warmth with which he was received in Africa. And then, of course, just one other thing, China in the Middle East, brokering the Iran-Saudi Arabia rapprochement. This is big. And thus, the US linked to Israel and genocide has been pushed to the side, and now China and Russia are the big players in the Middle East. This is almost mind-blowing. You could never have imagined anything close to this in the beginning of this cycle 24 years ago.
Let me ask you, we'll finish up with Ukraine. Interesting. You know, the neocons, U.S. imperialism, that was going to be the coup de grace. You know, that was the knife that they were going to sharpen up right at Russia's throat and cut their throat. That was it. They got it on board Russia's border. They got everything they wanted, but they didn't read the history books. The history books, what was it, King Charles the 12th or whatever of Sweden, who made the mistake of wandering into Russia, Napoleon, Hitler, on we go. They decided to go in and fight the Russians. It never worked out well. And it was not hard to predict how this would work out. And the Russians, slowly but surely, they will always turn the tide, and they will tend to, kind of like water, they envelop their enemy and they wash over it, and their enemy goes away. And now there is great weeping and gnashing of teeth in the ruling elite in Europe, who are waking up to the fact that they've been dragged down a dark alley and left there, facing the guillotines at some point. Or maybe even literally, some of them could be facing, you know, when the people wake up and realize what these people have done to their economy, there could be violence. Your thoughts on the importance of what has happened in Ukraine with the neocons trying to take Ukraine, and with the resolute actions of the Russians, who stood up and fought and said, you know, don't forget something. If you go too far, we'll nuke you. And I think they always, every now and then, I think the Russians had to brandish that weapon. They had to, kind of like the guy who goes like this and, don't forget, there's a weapon under here. I don't want any trouble, but don't forget, under here, there's, you know, a knife or a gun or whatever. And every now and then, Vladimir Putin would say, don't forget, if you guys decide to go too far, I have my nuclear weapons here. Enough to keep them all. That is what kept them at bay. But your thoughts of the importance of how this conflict, in the way that January 7th changed the world. I believe one of the reasons January 7th happened is because of the Ukraine conflict. When someone looked and saw somebody punch back at the hegemon, others are motivated. Well, let's throw the French the hell out of Africa. Well, what about the Israelis? Well, let's give them what for, why not, and do it again. The importance of the Ukraine conflict.
I think it's very, very interesting and very accurate the way you linked it to October 7th and the Ukraine struggle. Because it showed, you know, among other things, that the U.S. does not have the industrial capacity to supply arms to two wars. So even without a congressional vote, the U.S. still had these stockpiles of weapons, which they were, you know, going to send and was sending to the Ukraine. When the Gaza war starts, they then have to divert attention and arms to Israel. So Ukraine, which was at the top of their concern, moved down significantly. So much so that Victoria Nuland has announced her resignation from government. And she was big. She was the major player in the overturning of the government in Ukraine in 2014, and has been a major architect of the Ukrainian war against Russia, which is really a proxy war for the West and the United States. So now Ukraine is losing and will lose badly. Everybody says it. Can they hold on to Israel? Can the United States hold on? Can Israel continue to exist as a state? Will Israel, as they suffer increasing defeats in Gaza and on the northern border with Hezbollah, as their economy suffers as a consequence of the disruption of shipping, will the Israeli people rise up against the government will Israel, in the medium run, not even the long run, the medium run, become a failed state, unable to exist as a state? Will growing numbers of Israelis return to the countries from whence they came, i.e. Brooklyn, New York, and Petersburg, Russia? Will you return there? Maybe some from Odessa. Yes, they are. They've already begun it. The depopulation of Israel. So the way I look at it, Garland, 2 defeats in 2 wars that the neocons and the militarists, the hegemonists in this country thought they could easily win. They thought with sanctions they would bring Putin down. The opposite has been the case. When Biden went over there and embraced Netanyahu and said, brother, I'm with you to the end, ride or die, all that type of thing. And now that has blown up in their faces. I think we're close to now the 5th month of that war. Israel does not have the wherewithal in terms of its population nor its economy to deal with this much longer. And the Israeli lobby over here has now been exposed as running most of the members of the Congress and most of the members of the Congressional Black Caucus, sadly for us as Black people who fought for so much. But nonetheless, Zionism has become a word that is known and despised by tens of millions of people in the United States. Zionism, not Palestinians. Zionism is a symbol for hatred. And many people, including Orthodox Jews and Jewish Voices for Peace and Not in My Name, these Jewish organizations, are openly saying that Zionism is Nazism, that Zionism is racism. So these billionaires, these Jewish billionaires, which went after the presidents of Harvard and MIT and University of Pennsylvania as a way of saying, y'all better crack down on those rebellious students, they've totally failed. Because the student movement coming off of these campuses has broadened. And they're marching every day in the streets, carrying out civil disobedience. A new student movement. By the way, a student movement which also is endangering Biden's reelection because he has lost the youth. He's not going to get them back. But as you say, they're dangers because imperialism doesn't give up easily. Victoria Nuland might resign, but there are hundreds, thousands of neocons and think tanks and all of that in congressional offices, in the White House. They're all over the place. And of course, there's a huge investment in the military and the military-industrial complex. Profits off the charts. Maybe the most profitable part of the US economy. And of course, how big tech and AI and Facebook and all of that is tied up with the military-industrial complex. So there's a lot to unravel. The job is not hardly done. However, we have begun. The people have begun to protest. And as Frederick Douglass said, the great Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand, never has and never will. The people are making a demand, and those demands will become stronger The people will become more confident, more courageous. New leaders will emerge from movements, not from running for office, not from trying to be a city council person or state legislature to make sure you got health care, etc. It will come from movements of sacrifice. And on the front line of this will be young people, as they are on the front lines. And I've been at some huge demonstrations, some civil disobedience actions, and they are huge, and they are filled with people under 45. That critical age, because you got to do it when you're young, or you'll never do it. If you commit when you're young, you have something to stand on as you get older. If you never make a commitment, you never know how to commit to anything, and you never become anything. So we see a generation coming together on the battleground of the struggle for peace and liberation. And I'm so proud of them. I am just enormously impressed with them. Better than the anti-Vietnam War generation. They are more ideologically clear. You know, most people opposing the war in Vietnam were also essentially opposing the draft. There ain't no draft that these young people have to be worried about. Nonetheless, they continue to fight. And every day across this country, there is some form of civil disobedience, some form of shutting something down, some form of shutting down, for example, Adam Schiff at his victory party in California, shut down Hillary Clinton, shut down Samantha Powers, and Biden scared to show up anyway because he gonna be shut down. So this is a beautiful thing.
If I could ask one last, I know it's getting late, but one last thing. It is, the year of James Baldwin.
Yes.
If you could comment in the context of everything that's going on, James Baldwin was just absolutely brilliant in talking about the struggle for, Black liberation, of course, but he was an anti-imperialist. He pushed back against the war machine, against the establishment, against fairness for everybody. Your thoughts about the importance of the legacy of James Baldwin in the times that we're facing today?
Well, Garland, as you know, this year is the 100th anniversary of the birth of James Arthur Baldwin. He was born on August 2nd, 1924. So in Philadelphia, we, the Saturday Free School, have organized an entire year devoted to James Baldwin, and we call it James Arthur Baldwin, God's Revolutionary Voice, with the emphasis upon revolutionary voice, and that's what he was. Part of the tragedy of this country is that the people don't know James Baldwin. And often when they know him, it is through the lens of identity politics or queer politics or some sort of narrow Black politics. James Baldwin was a revolutionary, and all you have to do is read him to know it. An unbelievable genius, maybe America's greatest novelist, perhaps the greatest essayist in the history of the English language. He stands alone and as a singular figure in the ideological history of the United States and the ideological history of the West. And we, and myself included, are discovering that one cannot talk about the revolutionary future of humanity without including the thinking, the theorizing, the interrogation, the investigation into the human condition of James Baldwin. In the same way that radicals and revolutionaries of a previous era looked to Marx and Lenin, it is necessary for this period that we look at a James Baldwin. Not that we abandon Marx and Lenin, not by a long shot, but if there is a revolutionary future, and by revolution, I'm talking about a democratic movement to resituate power in the hands of the people, demos, democracy, the rule of the people. If that is to be fulfilled in this country, the trajectory of it, of its fulfillment, will in a huge way be dependent upon the indispensability of the thinking of James Baldwin. He is that huge. He is that significant.
Dr. Tony Monteiro, let people know before we go about where they can find information about your Saturday Free School, the work that you're doing, where they can find you online and find out about it.
Well, first of all, the year of Baldwin, which is our particular emphasis for the next year, you can go to our website, yearofjamesbaldwin.org. Also, twice a month, every other Sunday at 4 p.m., we have a podcast called James Baldwin, God's Revolutionary Voice, where we discuss his work and so on, its relevance for this time. You can find that on YouTube and on Spotify. So if you go to YouTube and put in Year of Baldwin, I think that'll come up. The other thing, those who are interested in the Saturday Free School, we can be easily found on Facebook, on X, on Instagram at the Saturday Free School. Now we meet every Saturday and we live stream it and archive those meetings. You can hear the way we think. I mean, it's not, it's just raw. It's us talking. It's us working through ideas. So there are many ways to contact us. I know in many parts of the country, here in Philadelphia, we will be reading Baldwin all over Philadelphia in churches and mosques and schools and bookstores, and that is now getting off the ground. But I would encourage people maybe to contact us if you want in your area to begin reading and studying Baldwin. It's worth doing. I think it's indispensable for our ideological development. Also, if you go to our page, either our web page, you will see our call, our vision statement for this year, where we attempt to establish that Baldwin is indeed a preeminent modern revolutionary. And he stands not only on the shoulders of others, which he does, but he stands beside the great revolutionary thinkers of the modern epoch.
Thank you very much. Everyone, the Saturday Free School, you can find them on Facebook. You can find them on X. Dr. Tony Monteiro does great work with there. A lot of young people, and I've gone up and met with them. And when you see the young people working for peace, when you see them pushing back against the neocons and looking for a new and revolutionary future, it's absolutely inspiring. I was inspired by the Asian and Korean youth who were working towards peace on the Korean Peninsula, having those discussions, having and doing things at their particular meeting centers in the community. Just fantastic work. Thank you very much, everyone. Don't forget, everything's going across the bottom there. You can follow me on Facebook and Telegram and all that kind of stuff. Thank you very much, everyone. And I will be on tomorrow morning, Thursday morning at 10 a.m. with Scott Ritter. Thank you. We're out.